Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought we might have a nice chat about subjects like astral travel, out-of-body experiences, liminal spaces, and related topics. I'm going to be sharing some of my personal stories and insights, so this is going to be more a recounting of my experiences rather than anything instructional, or at least it's not meant to be intentionally instructional. I'm going to throw in my own thoughts and 2 cents and tidbits, but really I just want to share some fun stories, hoping that you might enjoy them and also get some inspiration from them. I know this is an interesting topic for a lot of people, especially those of us in spiritual communities and magical spaces. And I know that there are a lot of different ways to think about what it means to astral travel and having out-of-body experiences depending on your culture, your belief systems, your practices. We all have different definitions and ways of perceiving and thinking about these topics. So I'm going to get into my own, and if this is something that you enjoy and are curious about, hang on for the ride. I have some stories from my journal. I know I have a video that's a little bit more instructional, I think, on astral travel, I believe, and I'll try to link that around. Likewise, I know I've talked a tiny bit about this journal in another video, but I've never shared specific stories, so I have some story times that I think will be fun. I basically filled this journal up in a year where I essentially spent time meditating every day for an entire year. I was not having the best time in life, and pretty quickly into this, I started to have these experiences where I felt like I would go somewhere or someplace, and I'd encounter different beings and entities and have these experiences that were really transformative for me. I would say that I don't do this as much now. I really wish that I did. This was more so something I engaged in out of necessity, and this was very much at the very beginning of my magical journey as a magical practitioner and into my spiritual life. My very consciously dedicated spiritual life, I should say. The only thing that I think I did magically inclined and intentionally before this was a banishing spell on a roommate, and that was a very interesting experience, but this was really my first sort of foray into the magical world, and I was looking for an escape, I was looking for help, I was looking for answers, and I do think that in dire times, when we talk about, for example, dark night of the soul, tower moments, those are the times when we turn to spirituality looking to either escape or be held for answers for things that we can't explain. And I think that that's just a common thread that persists throughout the world at large, across cultures, and it's something that can unite us. So for me, I remember the first time I did this, I was skeptical, I lit a candle. For me, at the time, I was very new to everything, I hadn't done much research, and so I didn't even know about astral travel or out-of-body experiences when I began to do this. At least I hadn't read about them in any technical manner, and I'm kind of glad that that was the way that I went about it, because I think if I had, I would have overthought it, and I think one of my biggest tips is to not get too bogged down in the minutia or the details. I think it's very easy for us as humans to want to categorize everything into boxes. We want names for entities and deities. It's either this or it's that, or I am in an astral space, or I am here, or I am there. It all, in my opinion, bleeds together, and trying to assign definitive borders and boundaries and definitions to terms and topics and things is a little bit limiting. That's my experience. I, for example, don't find it very helpful to necessarily need to culturally fit a certain entity or give it a name based on a god or a goddess or something that's been written down. I don't find it super helpful to try to define what I'm doing in any specific manner. I think that that takes away from the experience for me. So needless to say, I lit a candle. I had this sort of idea that that was going to be my anchor. I was a little bit fearful going into this, but I was willing to work past that fear. And at first, it took me a while to clear my head. I think I had to focus on my breathing in and out for quite some time. I didn't even have the intention that I was going to go anywhere or do anything, but after a while, I started to drift, and it almost felt like I was somewhere between being awake and being asleep. And then suddenly I was in this field, or at least I was imagining seemed like I was imagining myself inside of this big open field. There was a stream, the grass was a little bit taller, not too tall. It was a bright sunny day, it was warm, and I saw one gigantic tree. It was quite large, and I believe it was an apple tree, if I'm not mistaken. At least it had apples on it, but it looked pretty big for an apple tree. So if it was an apple tree, it was a very old, well-established apple tree. So I approached it, and it turned out to be sentient in this imaginal way. At the time, I kind of just thought this might have been very visual meditation or active imagination. And I do think that things like active imagination and visualizations bleed into what I imagine to be the astral realm. I don't think there's any hard and fast, this is, you stop here and this is where this begins and this is where this ends. I think it's all a little bit of a gray zone. We're not working with black and white here. So I began to talk to the tree, or the tree talked to me, and it was, it was kind of conveying to me this sort of safety. I sat beneath the tree. It offered me one of its apples, which I ate, and I just felt really warmed and welcomed, and it just felt like I was being hugged. And in the moment, that was really something that I needed, and I didn't really know that I needed it. And I asked a little bit about where I was and what the tree was, what this entity or being was, and I guess I got a little bit of an explanation of this just being a space that's not physical. It's a space between spaces, or a space of its own, sort of like a pocket or a 1 degree of many that can be visited, or that sort of thing, and that the tree was there to welcome me or sort of initiate me into this space. And so I sat there for a while, and eventually I went on my way and sort of imagined that candle that I'd lit and returned to my body, or back into that meditative state where I slowly started to focus again on my breathing, and then opened my eyes. And from there, I began to consciously make the effort, once I started the meditations, to enter that sort of space. I actually didn't end up interacting with that entity or that tree-like being very much. I think it was more of just a welcomer for me. And the beings that I ended up interacting with a lot while I was there, there were a few recurring entities or beings, and I do believe that in the way that I was perceiving this, I was not controlling necessarily these beings. I wasn't the one. If I was creating them, whether I was or wasn't doesn't necessarily matter to me. I know it matters to some people, but the things that they would say were very much not things that I was consciously compelling them to say or imagining them to say. They would say things that surprised me a lot of times. But over time, I began to slowly encounter beings and entities that I worked with more so, and they became more like teachers and guides, especially throughout that year. I know in some cultures, this would be more of like a shamanic type experience, I guess. In others, it might be considered more of like being over the hedge, or visiting different like dimensions or levels if you're more into that sort of galactic thing. I really think that they're all kind of one and the same, so that's just my take on that. But one being that I encountered and worked with quite a bit, was a guy in a robe. At least that's how I saw him and envisioned him. He had a beard, almost very like Jesus-like in some ways, but I remember I was on what appeared to be like a very rocky green grassy cliff in what I imagine was maybe like the UK or Ireland. At least that's what it was appearing to me. I saw a fire, and this man was by the fire, and he had no eyes. His head was kind of like hollow inside, but there was flames behind the sockets, and it wasn't scary like you might imagine. I know that that sounds scary, but there was something very comforting and warm, like there was a fire inside of this being. And over the time that I was there, I think I met with him the most, and a lot of the lessons that I learned or experiences that I had were through this lens or this framework of imagining an inner flame, which I know is something that is across cultures, the idea of having an inner flame as a spirit or cultivating that. We see allegories of this in the Bible and various religious texts and in mythologies. I even asked, for example, when, say, I was starting to become more established on my magical journey, asking, are you a specific deity or entity? And the response I got was, well, who do you basically want me to be. Like when I asked, what is your name, or what is this, what do you want me to be? And so I think that it was more of an essence or an archetype or an entity that in a lot of ways, I think a lot of these things are across various cultures, and we just assign names and they appear to us in a visual sense the way that we want them to be or want them to appear. We name them a certain thing and they take on a little bit of a different sort of quality to them. But I like to avoid names and labels. I think that for me, it's a more authentic and true experience rather than trying to box them into an Irish mythology or a Norse pantheon. I just worked with the flame, I would call him. But I would regress into certain memories at times and work through them. I actually had certain childhood memories that I'd completely blocked out and forgotten that surfaced during these exercises, and I always felt safe. I tended to visit this flame character in a cottage, and we would usually talk before we got into anything. Some days we would just talk, and I would ask about advice or perspective. I would look for answers. Some days we would, like I said, go into these sort of memory regressions where I'd revisit certain memories that I didn't know I had, and I'd be able to intervene and interact with those memories. Sometimes I was just an observer. Other times I would either like rewrite them or overwrite them in some ways, or after the experience, sort of talk them through and talk them out. Other times I would visit spaces to access certain knowledge. There was another entity and being that I often saw, a woman. She was in blue, and it was interesting because I don't think that this space was either good or bad. I think it was very neutral, and I had a handful of experiences that were a little bit on the frightening side when it came to this type of thing. Not many, and I don't think that I was ever in imminent danger. I know that when it comes to magic and traveling, I see on like TikTok and all these things, people preaching and pontificating about the dangers and you have to be educated. It comes off to me very preachy, honestly. If you're out there looking for permission to do what you want, you've got it here. I say go for it, do whatever the hell you want, call it whatever you want. Don't let anybody else tell you what you need to do or what you should be doing, or that what you're doing is this or that, or it's wrong or it's right. Honestly, I say, fuck everybody else if they're trying to steer you in a certain direction that's not natural for you. But yeah, very neutral. So this woman actually was more neutral. Sorry, a little divergence from the path, but I think it's important to know that, you have to just do what you want. Don't let others make you think that you're not experienced or you're not ready or you can't do this or you have to do this or it's not safe. I think all things in life entail a degree of danger. Walking out my door, if I don't know what I'm doing and don't know how to walk and drive the car, is dangerous. But I had to learn. I had to go out and do that at some point, and now I can do it. You got to just, learn through practice. I think practice is the key here. Learn through doing. But this woman was very neutral. She would show up sometimes. She was not at all this sort of archetype of a maternal figure in any way. In fact, I felt very comforted and safe with the flame, and this woman would come and go. She was very just like, almost like capricious in that, one day she would not care so much, another day she would care to show up. She would never really be there in a comforting way. She would show up with words of wisdom or at certain moments, but it was more so this like more paternal flame that was actually very comforting, and like I felt very held and safe, versus the more feminine archetype that would appear, who was very cool, almost like a watery figure in some ways, but a little bit detached. And I learned certain lessons from her as well. And some days I would interact with one or the other. I had a few one-off experiences. Some beings and entities I would encounter on occasion there was one that reminded me of the Hermit from a tarot card. A little bit different, but he was more of like a sage, old, wise man in gray. He walked with a walking stick and would sometimes guide me into these like deeper realms. I would go below the earth sometimes with him, or I would go on these long trail walks and we would talk about certain things, and he had a very unique sort of presence to him. Another was a sort of younger, very like edgy bookshop owner or librarian type guy who was a little bit eccentric, and at times the first time I remember encountering that entity or being was in a version of a Barnes and Nobles in my sort of astral travels. Another time it was just a bookshop. Another time it was a library. One time it was just bookshelves out in the middle of nature. It was kind of every once in a while I just needed to access this sort of book area. I know some people are like, oh, Akashic Records, this and that. I'm not sure how I would categorize it or call it. I didn't feel the need to give it a name, but I would often find myself in these rows of books looking for certain things, and then eventually this elusive character who was kind of cheeky would appear, and usually I had to seek him out, and he wasn't as forthcoming with just appearing. But that was an interesting I saw him a couple of times. Same for the Hermit. Those were not reoccurring characters that I would see on a very regular basis. So I had a multitude of experiences. I remember one that did. There was one instance where I was walking somewhere and I occasionally saw different entities. Once there was a woman who wasn't paying much attention to me, and I wasn't sure why I could see her or like the reasoning. And I was told by, I think I was either with that one woman or the flame type character, and they said, don't bother her. She's not going to bother you, but if you bother her, she might react. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll leave her alone. There was another entity I began to see often later into my times doing this, who was more of like a very natural almost spirit. And I would visit her at a pool of water. And this was more of like a friend rather than a mentor in this space. And as far as I could kind of tell, she remained around this pool of water, and I would go into the pool and we would swim or hang around the shore, but she didn't really leave that space. And we would just talk about life, and it was more of a peer feeling experience, like a friend or a peer rather than a mentor or somebody to help. Yeah, I had a bunch of experiences along those sorts of lines. I wouldn't say I do this as much these days. It was something that was very necessary for me, and I worked through a lot of my own personal struggles, and I found a lot of solace and insight, and I think I grew a lot through experiences in this space. I never really imagined until I started reading books that astral travel, as it was perceived, or out-of-body experiences, that you could go somewhere in the tangible world, like you could astral project to your friend's house or room and describe what you saw or something like that, more of like a remote viewing. That's never been something that I've been able really to do, or I've never had an experience where I've done that and it felt super accurate and authentic to me. Whenever I've felt like I was not in my body or in a different space, it was always in these sorts of places. And I do think that there are various types of places. For example, one where I felt a little, I tried flying ointment actually that I got from a witch shop, that an online witch shop. I forget, I would link it if I could remember. It was years ago. And I was with that hermit character. I went below. He said he wanted to show me something, and I was in a space that felt more like a void. I would say it was dark, but it was more like there was nothing almost in some ways. There was like a vacuum, and inside that vacuum were almost like these sort of like shadows or interesting entities. And we had a light, so we had a sort of circumference or radius around us of light to walk through and just experience this place. And on the edges of the light were these creatures that couldn't come closer, but they looked very grotesque and just things that you would almost like the things of like nightmares. I didn't feel unsafe, but I did start to feel very confused in that space. And I have, of course, had that sort of hermit guy with me who would guide me, and we ended up leaving. But that was one time where I felt like maybe I went somewhere that I either wasn't supposed to or just wasn't ready for, or was not one of my favorite experiences. Over time, also, I guess, you hear a lot of these things, an animal guide or spirit. There was, after a while, in a forest, a red fox came up to me, and that became a sort of entity or creature or being that would follow me a lot of the time and would be sort of like a companion. They never spoke, It was a silent sort of entity, but there was this sort of rapport, and I almost felt like they were there as like somewhat of a protection to teach me. I have an opinion that you may know I work with deities and just higher powers in general. I've made videos on the Sheila Nagig and the angel Gabriel, that when we encounter certain entities or deities or beings, whether it's a saint, an angel, a god, a goddess, that we are looking to learn something from them, and that's why we sort of attract them into our equation, whether you are very similar to them in your qualities or whether you're looking to emulate and could benefit from the qualities that they exemplify, that they represent. I think that all of that plays into it, and that's a big part of why we interact with people, and in spiritual sense, non-physical beings and entities are all there to, I would say they are reflections of things that we are, things that we need, things that we want, things that we know we could learn from. That being said, a fox companion I felt like exemplified myself perhaps a little bit. At the time I didn't realize that, but over time I came to feel a sort of kindredness with that companion. There was also a snake, but the snake never really, I wasn't like a snake that I met every time I would enter this space or a space. One time I encountered it and it sort of crawled into my skin, not in a painful or weird, grotesque way, but more of a merging, if that makes sense, in my arm. It sort of wrapped around my arm and it was in my skin, and I felt like I absorbed it and carried it with me, rather than it existing outside of me and being something that I continued to interact with. But yeah, all of this is to say that, and I guess those are a few tidbits of stories of things that I've experienced, but if you're out there and looking to try any of this for yourself, if you do already engage in these sorts of practices, or if they've always felt a little bit unapproachable, I can definitely relate and resonate. I think that sometimes books are just as much of a hindrance as they are a help, in that a book will give you these very definitive instructions for something that's so fluid and natural and intuitive. You know, to have a book to give you instructions is almost the antithesis to me of what this process is. And so trying to approach it in a super regimented, step by step, I have to do X, Y, and Z, and this is exactly what I am doing, is not as helpful in my opinion. At least that's been the case for me and my personal findings when I read books. Although I find them very interesting on these sorts of topics, the instructions, if I were to try them out, I think would limit and almost act as a barrier to the experience itself. Likewise, if I were to try to have assigned names and cultural sort of spiritual path-oriented titles and visages to these beings and places that I think that also would have limited what I viewed, or at least it would have warped how it appeared for me. It appeared for me in the way that it needed to, and I didn't feel the need to assign anything super definitive. But I think it's great to record those experiences if you are doing this. In here, I was recording the general gist of any important lessons, conversations, things I encountered and did, and occasionally I'll go back and read this. I was also given instructions, especially from the flame and other beings that I would work with, of exercises to do in the real world. Go out and try these breathing exercises, these visualization exercises. So these were sort of teachers and mentors to me, and I would record the lessons that they would impart. I would record me trying out the sorts of lessons they asked me to. I also recorded my dreams. I found that over time, my time spent in the space would bleed into my real life. I would have dreams where I would pick up exactly where I left off in this space, and sometimes a dream would reoccur, and I would have a better sort of dream recall, and I got really good about recording my dreams and remembering my dreams as well. Those two spaces didn't feel all that dissimilar from each other. In fact, they felt very similar. And I also started to notice more synchronicities in my real life. I found that my magic was more potent. I was doing these exercises that were very specific and unique and tailored to my experience, that were given to me by these sort of teachers and mentors. And I started to encounter certain people and scenarios and objects and those sorts of things, those sorts of symbols that you see over and over again. I had so much more of those going on when I was actively engaged in this, when I was doing this every day. And I do think that this really helped me to turn my life around, to grow substantially in a very pressurized moment in my life. And I'm really glad that I felt very naturally drawn to using this and embarking on this path as a means of coping and healing and just, I would say, getting myself on track rather than falling deeper into a hole. So this was, and that place was and is sort of a refuge for me. And I may not visit it nearly as much now. I'm sure that there will come points in my life, we never stay at our highest highs forever, but where it may be necessary for me to revisit these. And I'm really glad that I've recorded them. This would be my number one tip to most people in any spiritual walk, practice, belief, to record as much as you can. It's so important. When I look at younger James's experiences here, I feel this sort of connection. It's almost like I can re-embody the James then. I can even talk to him. I can see his mind and how it worked. And I can also return to a lot of these lessons. And, you know, the memory is very subjective. It's a very fluid, ever-changing sort of medium of information storage, and this is very concrete, and I value it for that. So I hope this was fun. Let me know some of your experiences, if you've had similar ones, if your time in other realms has been completely different from mine. I'm very curious, and the way that you approach it, of course, I love different perspectives. And if this is something that you haven't done and are looking to engage in, please feel free to ask questions. I know I can't cover everything in one video. I just wanted to share some of my stories, hoping that they might be fun for some people out there, for our little community. But like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting, and until next time, bye.